stage stood empty under an open sky. Afternoon light cut across the rough boards like a knife. Thousands of bodies pressed in close. Merchants still smelling of the market, apprentices with ink on their fingers, nobles in stiff collars, and ordinary people whose boots still carried the mud of the river. The air held sawdust, sweat, smoke, and the faint iron smell of the Thames. Then a man stepped forward. He was not tall. He was not rich. He was not born to any title the world would have recognized. He opened his mouth, and the whole crowd forgot to breathe. 400 years later, those same words still move through the air on every continent. They still stop strangers in the middle of a sentence. They still make the living feel the weight of the dead. That man was William Shakespeare. The question that has never been fully answered is how a glove maker's son from a quiet riverside town became the strongest force the English language has ever known. The year was 1564. Stratford-upon-Avon sat along a gentle bend of the Avon River. It was a market town of timbered houses, church bells, orchards heavy with fruit, and the sharp smell of tanneries. People knew one another's business by the time the morning mist lifted from the water. Into this ordinary world a child was born to John Shakespeare, a man who worked leather until it became soft enough for a gentleman's hand, and to Mary Arden, whose family held land that had been theirs longer than most living memories. The house was modest. The future was not yet written on any page. Young William walked the same narrow streets every day. He learned the smell of cured hides from his father's workshop. He learned the hard sound of Latin from the wooden benches of the grammar school. 6 days a week the boys rose before the light was full and stayed until candles were needed. They translated the old Roman writers until the lines lived in their bones. They memorized long passages. They recited them aloud. They were punished when memory failed. Yet something in the boy gathered those ancient stories the way other children gathered smooth river stones. Carefully, protectively, as if the words themselves might one day be needed to stay alive. He loved the way a sentence could turn and surprise. He loved the sound of words more than the things they named. Even as a child he seemed to collect them the way others collected feathers or bright bits of glass. He married at 18. Anne Hathaway was 26, already carrying the weight of an earlier life. The marriage brought a daughter named Susanna, then twins, a boy called Hamnet, and a girl called Judith. For a time the young husband seemed fixed in the pattern of the town, the workshop, the market square, the slow turning of the seasons, the same faces in the same streets. But restlessness is a quiet fire. Sometime in the middle of his 20s that fire grew strong enough to pull him away. He left Stratford. He left his wife. And his children. He left the known streets and the known faces. The records fall silent. People who study the past still call those years the lost years, because the man who would later fill libraries with his voice left almost no trace of his own footsteps on the long road to London. London in the late 1580s was a living contradiction. Dirt and brilliance side by side. Sickness and poetry. The heavy stench of the river mixed with the smell of roasting meat and newly cut wood. More than 200,000 people crowded inside and outside the old walls. Theaters had begun to rise just beyond the city's legal reach. Great round wooden buildings open to the weather. A single penny-bought standing room in the yard and the chance to watch human nature torn open and put back together in 2 short hours. The crowds were loud. They cheered. They shouted. They threw food when a play failed them. Into this noise and danger stepped a young man with no powerful friends, no university degree, and nothing to sell except the words that had been collecting inside him since childhood. He found work among the players. Whether he first spoke lines on stage or moved scenery or both is still debated by those who study the records, but the writing came soon enough. Early plays about English kings appeared. Stories of power taken and power lost, of ambition that destroyed its own children. Comedies followed, sharp enough to make the standing crowd shout with laughter and the people in the higher seats lean forward in their seats. Then deeper plays arrived, the ones in which characters were no longer simply good or evil, but both at once, confused, afraid, proud, and strangely bright. Audiences saw themselves on the stage. That recognition was the true beginning of everything. He joined a company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, one of the finest groups of actors in the city. They performed in the public playhouses. They performed at court before Queen Elizabeth herself. The glove maker's son from Stratford stood in the presence of the Queen and spoke lines he had written with his own hand. Fame arrived the way weather arrives. First a change in the air, then the full storm. People quoted him in the streets. They returned to the same play 3 times in a single week. He wrote with a speed and clearness that still surprises anyone who looks at the dates. At least 37 plays, 154 short poems of 14 lines each. The amount of work alone would have been a full life's labor for most men. For him it was only the surface of what he carried. In 1599 the company built its own theatre on the south bank of the river and named it the Globe. It was round. It was made of timber. It stood open to the sky. 3,000 people could pack inside when the weather held. The poorest stood in the open yard, faces tilted upward toward the stage. The wealthier sat in the covered seats above. There were no bright stage lights, no microphones, no painted scenery beyond what language itself could create. Afternoon sunlight was the only light the actors had. On that bare stage the greatest stories of the age took breath and walked. 2 young people from enemy families who loved each other past the point of survival. A prince who saw his father's ghost, and then had to decide what justice would cost him. A brave soldier who killed a king and discovered that the crown was heavier than any armor. Lovers who wandered through a magical wood and came out changed by what they had seen. The plays traveled farther than any ship. They crossed oceans. They entered languages Shakespeare himself never heard spoken. 400 years later they are still performed every single day somewhere on the earth. Yet the man who gave the language so many of its lasting tools also knew what it was to lose what could never be replaced. In 1596 his only son, Hamnet, died at the age of 11. The burial record is short and plain. The silence around it is not. The later plays carry a different weight, an older sorrow, a quieter emptiness that sits under the words. A king howling on a stormy heath while the world breaks around him. A statue that comes to life only after long years of regret and waiting. Whether the private loss entered the public work can never be proven beyond all doubt. But the timing is hard to ignore. The man who could invent more than 1,000 new words still had no words strong enough to bring a child back from the ground. Then came the fire. In 1613, during a performance of a play about King Henry VIII, a ceremonial cannon was fired on stage for effect. A spark found the dry thatched roof. Within 2 hours the Globe was nothing but ash and blackened timber. No one died in the flames. The building that had held so many living voices was simply gone. By then Shakespeare had already begun the long walk home. He returned to Stratford, to the large house called New Place, to the town that had once been too small to hold him. The restless young man who had left with almost nothing came back as the most celebrated writer in England. He had money, he had land, he had the quiet of the river again. But the years in London had taken their price. On the 23rd of April in 1616 he died. He was 52 years old. They buried him in the Church of the Holy Trinity beneath a stone that still carries a short, sharp poem warning anyone who might disturb the bones. Even at the end, the words would not leave him alone. What remains is not a collection of private letters or a book of confessions. What remains is the work itself. More than 1,700 words that the English language did not possess until he needed them. Lonely, eyeball, bedroom, gloomy, fashionable, and hundreds more. Everyday phrases that still walk the streets without anyone remembering where they first came from. Break the ice, wild goose chase, heart of gold, all that glitters is not gold. The 6 most famous words in the language still belong to a Danish prince who never existed outside the theater. The plays themselves continue to hold up a mirror that does not grow old or crack. Love and jealousy, power and fear, the hunger for justice and the deep terror of being truly known. These do not belong to one century or one country. They belong to every human heart that has ever beaten. He was not a king. He was not a general. He was not born into the fine rooms where history is usually written down. He was a boy who collected words the way other boys collected feathers or bright stones, who left a small town because the words demanded a larger stage, who returned when the stage had taken what it needed from him. He proved that language is not a fixed inheritance handed down unchanged from father to son. It is a living tool that can be reshaped by anyone with the courage and the ear to try. One man, armed only with a feather pen, a bottle of ink, and a stubborn love for the music of speech, enlarged that tool so that every speaker who came after him could reach notes and feelings that had not existed before. The theaters still fill with people. The lines are still spoken by actors who were not yet born when the last original audience member died. School children still struggle through the denser passages, and then, without warning, feel the sudden drop of recognition when a character's private fear or sudden joy becomes their own. The man from Stratford left no long explanation of how he did it. He left only the evidence. And the evidence is still speaking, still breathing, still changing the way people understand their own lives. What do you hear when you listen closely to the English you use every day? How many of its sharpest and most useful tools were first shaped by a restless glove maker's son who simply refused to accept that the language he inherited was finished and closed? History has judged him the greatest writer the English tongue